I'm very excited to bring you a very special feature presentation this morning. Work that was completed by Nuka Research on behalf of DEP, given their contractor capacity, and supportive of our MOSPRA program and efforts, and clearly with everything we do, and in addition to environmental protection, also climate resiliency and oil spill preparedness efforts. We are excited to bring this particular topic to you. So I just want to see if Elise DeCola is
I am here.
right there. Wonderful, Elise. We are so excited to have you this morning. I just felt as though this would be just very important work that our membership and the committee members would really benefit learning about just cutting edge information and research that you have embarked on. And therefore, it's my honor to introduce you, Elise, this morning, the General Manager at Nuka Research. And so with that, I stand down and have you on the spotlight, Elise. Thank you.
Thanks, Melly. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and highlight some of the work that we've recently completed on a multi-year project that focused on evaluating and adapting the MOSPRA program, the Marine Oil Spill Preparedness and Response Act program activities against climate change, and to build resilience within that program and more broadly within the Commonwealth. So I'm going to touch on a few different topics. I'll give just a bit of context to MOSPRA. I assume that most on the line are familiar with this component of your bureau. I'll talk a little bit about the project as a whole. It was, as I said, a multi-year initiative with several different streams. But I am going to focus on the last stream of work we did, which was a collaborative workshop where we took some research and brought it to experts and worked through some scenarios and talked about some of the challenges and opportunities where climate change and adaptation may intersect with the MOSPRA program activities. And ultimately, we came up with some recommendations for future work that I believe we'll be embarking on hopefully soon. So for those that aren't familiar with or don't work on the day-to-day basis with the MOSPRA program, we have Kathy Kiley on, and this program sits within her part of MassDEP, and it has a number of different components. There's planning that we do for potential mitigating coastal oil spills, so through booming strategies and other activities. There is a training component where we work with fire and hazard and harbor master departments to train them to deploy that boom to protect those coastal sites. There's an equipment program where MassDEP has funded upwards of 80 trailers, I believe now, in coastal and inland communities to give them the equipment that they would need to protect their important resources from spills. There's an ongoing risk assessment element that looks at how the threats and potential consequences of marine oil spills may be changing over time. And there's a navigational safety component that focuses more on prevention through things like observational buoys that are getting real-time weather data to mariners, and escort tugs and inspections that keep oil-carrying vessels safe in Massachusetts waters. So our project looked sort of broadly across the sphere of climate change. We considered the hazards, also the adaptations, so not just storm surge and hurricanes and sea level rise, but also activities that are ongoing in Massachusetts communities to adapt to and mitigate those hazards. We also considered decarbonization, which has kind of a unique link into oil spill programs as we're seeing a shift away from hydrocarbons. And we ultimately wanted to look for sort of implications and indicators that the MOSPRA program should be considering now to be prepared in the future for what might be coming. So there's a number of reports that we generated that you see on the right of this slide. We started with a literature review. We did a threat assessment that updated. We looked at AIS vessel traffic. We looked at deliveries of oil to marine terminals, and did a little bit of a quantitative analysis to compare different water bodies and ports within the Commonwealth. We then held the workshop, which I mentioned at the beginning, and we'll talk a bit more about. And then we tied it all together in a final report that is finalized and in the process of being posted to MassDEP's website. So really what we set out to do was to try to envision a somewhat uncertain future in terms of what does it look like in 20 or 30 years? What do the risks look like? How might hazards and adaptations change or influence what's happening within the MOSPRA program? And how does decarbonization come into play? And these sort of broad questions shaped the whole of the work that we undertook. I'll kind of share with you a few of the takeaways that we discovered along the way. So when we looked at climate hazards and thought about the changes to the oil spill risk landscape, there are a number of things that are happening, and many of these are self-evident, but we're seeing more frequent spills that happen during or after climate events. So a lot of these events involve disruption to boats at anchor, or they may exacerbate issues that already exist with wrecked and abandoned vessels that are at dock and aren't well taken care of. So we're seeing small spills and debris from those. We're also seeing changes to the environment. We're seeing other stressors on the marine environment that may change the consequences of spills when they do occur. We also looked a little bit at exposure, and we have thought a lot about transitional risks. All of these changes are occurring, in real time, and so what a coastline looks like today isn't necessarily what it's going to look like in a year or what it looked like a year ago. And so how to deal with that transition and uncertainty. And we also focused in on environmental justice, which is increasingly, I think, a lens that we all put to the work that we're doing. And for this program, the communities that are already at high risk for oil spills that are located near some of the larger marine terminals are also largely environmental justice communities. And so how do we factor that into future mitigation of climate hazards and potential oil spill risks? We also talked quite a bit about access to response. So in order to respond to an oil spill, you need to be able to get to a boat ramp, you need to be able to load equipment, you need to be able to access a site. And all of those things are often problematic with the types of storms that we see, and as kind of climate exacerbates those storms. It also creates concerns around responder safety. So obviously, MassDEP or any other responding organization doesn't want to send people into harm's way. So understanding, and balancing the need for a quick and effective environmental response against the need to take care of your own personnel is continuing to be an issue as we see more climate hazards. And then we're also seeing increased complexity, and this is really universal across the country and the world. But more and more, when we have a climate-driven environmental pollution event, it's often happening at the same time that you may have a humanitarian event. You may have people needing to be evacuated. You may have casualties. You may have other types of incidents going on. And so that increased complexity is something that we noted as wanting to incorporate into building a more resilient MOSPRA program. So we also focused a bit on climate resilience. So what's ongoing now at the state level, at the community level, to build resilience for these hazards that everyone knows is coming. And the focus here is in on Boston Harbor, where there's been a lot of really good work underway to do things like raising walkways, raising roadways. There's a lot of building of additional marsh areas to absorb some of sea level rise and storm surges. And so how do these changing urban and coastal shorelines impact a lot of the planning that we've done that's very shoreline geomorphology driven? Oh, and let me go back there. So this is an inset here of geographic response strategies. Again, this is within Boston Harbor. So these are those booming strategies that MOSPRA has been developing across the Commonwealth. And as we see changes to the shoreline, we may need to change these strategies, which are ultimately anchored to the shoreline. And then decarbonization is probably the most complex component to this in many ways because it's really driven by external factors. What we know internally, the drivers within Massachusetts are extremely aggressive decarbonization targets. Massachusetts is a national leader in decarbonizing, and we're seeing that a lot of those efforts we're seeing wind and solar and other other non decarbonized energy solutions. But there's also a lot of international drivers. A big one is shipping. So Boston Harbor, Boston's a major port for us here in the Northeast, but worldwide, it's not as big a player as somewhere like Rotterdam or Hong Kong. And so there are trends that are being driven globally around replacement fuels for some of the traditional ship fuels that will eventually impact bunkering. So, for example, we're starting to see LNG as a ship fuel. So we may start to see more bunkering of ships, so more loading of LNG as a ship fuel. What does that mean to a program that's really been built around response to petroleum spills? So we looked at all of those kind of components and brought this work together after a couple of years of research and interviews with experts into a workshop that was held last May, a year ago May now. And we used a method called strategic foresight, which is sometimes called futures theory and some of the other words you see on the bottom. It's essentially a kind of almost a games theory approach to using scenarios to envision a little bit further into the future than we often do. In spill planning, we use a lot of very scenarios that are very focused on specific events. Strategic foresight gives us a more expansive thought view or process to look at all of the realm of different potential futures, and then to work backwards from those to think about how might we get there, how do we know we're on that path, and what can we do in the interim to disrupt us going places that we don't want the program to go, or to drive the program towards places that we think would be beneficial to the resilience and the effectiveness of the MOSPRA program. So this is just a kind of a conceptual diagram that sort of contrasts the concept of futures thinking, which is more like a flashlight. So you shine a flashlight beam, and in the middle is kind of the stuff that is more obvious. So we know there's going to be more wind energy because that's happening already. But then there may be other things in the future that we're not seeing because the signals are less clear or they're further out there. And so we use the kind of the foresight approach and scenarios to sort of expand our view outward. So rather than looking through a keyhole where you really only see what's framed by the hole, we start to look more expansively. And this was kind of I've boiled a year's worth of discipline into 2 slides, but this was the approach that we took to the workshop a year ago, May, that kind of helped us to crystallize together all of the work we'd done. So we focused the workshop on 3 geographic areas, and these areas had kind of popped during our threat assessment as having, kind of particularly relatively higher threat. We didn't really use the risk word because we didn't go into consequences enough, but we looked at exposure to potential spills. And so we focused on New Bedford, Boston Harbor, and Vineyard Haven. And we looked at sort of 2 components: the first, climate hazards and adaptations, and the second, decarbonization. And then we broke into very small groups. Each group had very detailed scenario cards that prompted them to think about a wide range of potential issues associated with various factors, many of which I kind of laid out in those initial slides, considerations for how climate and oil spill response may intersect in the present and in the future. So an example of the types of scenario cards that we put in front of people in New Bedford, for example, we gave them quite a bit of information kind of as background. So on the left, you see a slide showing mystery spills. So New Bedford has a mystery spill problem. There's lots of spills that are occurring within the harbor without a clear source, many of them likely from fishing vessels in the harbor. And so that's an ongoing pollution source. And then there are new things happening in New Bedford. It's a hub for offshore wind. It is also a hub on the bottom right, you see there, for transportation of bulk oil to some of the smaller terminals on the islands. And then we know there's an enormous fishing fleet with very high value fisheries going on there. So all these factors come into play when you start to think about risk and resilience. At the same time, there's a number of adaptations ongoing there and elsewhere. Some have to do with, you can see a couple of slides here where we took in some projections from NOAA and other sources on sea level rise and hurricanes. And one of the tracks of projections is that eventually the hurricane barrier that's been in place since the 60s, I believe, in New Bedford, in future hurricane scenarios, it's overwashed, so it's not necessarily serving its purpose anymore. So we're going to see different inundation. At the same time, the harbor is actively imposing resilience guidance to do things like raise piers and try to make themselves more climate proof. And then there are adaptations like marsh building and others to try to foster sea level rise and flooding resilience. So taking all of that together and with various prompts, how do we look at what should we be thinking about? What are some of the potential future scenarios that we might consider, and how can we methodically work through that? So we had each little group kind of come up with sticky notes with different really thoughts like this might happen. So for example, the width of the hurricane barrier may make it hard for vessels going in and out of the harbor to they may collide with it, and a number of different kind of thoughts that the participants had, and then we mapped them using a risk certainty matrix. So on the y-axis, you see the impact from low to high, and on the x, you see level of certainty low to high. And that exercise helps you to focus on, okay, the things that we are pretty sure have a fairly high level of certainty and would be pretty impactful, kind of go in the upper right there. Maybe that's where we should start looking. And maybe some of these other things we're not as certain of them, but maybe we could find signals that we could be looking for. And one final thing I'll just point out is that you see negatives and pluses on each of these stickies. Not all of the futures that we pondered were adverse. There are some benefits, some beneficial futures, and those are the ones that we wanted to look at driving the program towards. So some of the common themes kind of echo what I talked about at the beginning. Issues around accessing sites for response, issues around changes in vessel traffic and navigation. We've got the construction phase for offshore wind, but then when it's operable, we're going to be seeing different vessel traffic servicing those wind fields. Changing response measures as the shoreline changes, including, sorry, I can't read my slide, socioeconomic considerations, as I mentioned, environmental justice and others, and then worrying about infrastructure when there are inundations. Let's see. So the other stream we looked at was decarbonization. And so some of our prompts there got a little bit more kind of out there. So things like electric tugs and ferries, we're seeing those worldwide. They're starting to come into play. Electrification of boating is happening. How might that play out? What might that look like? Offshore wind, we've talked about a bit already. And then autonomous vessels is another trend. I believe the vessel on the right of the slide is in Norway, but they're starting to use autonomous vessels in place of road traffic to move things in coastal areas. So how do these future trends play in? What are the pluses and the minuses associated with them? So we used a different kind of thought exercise to synthesize that discussion. Again, I'm boiling down 4 hours worth of discussion into a 60-second slide here. But essentially, we use what they call a futures wheel, where you look at different kind of trends. So I'll just focus the top one there: energy transition through local resilience, freight reduction, and electronic vessel and vehicle adaptation or adoption. So the futures wheel looks sort of sequentially out at different future horizons. So the near term horizon, the next kind of 2 to 5 years, what do we see? We see less heating oil in the winter, gasoline in the summer, decline of freight vessels. So what's the next ring there? Fewer oil spills. That's fantastic. What might happen from there? Well, maybe we'll start having less equipment and safety gear, and we'll be less ready for oil spills. So how do we kind of look at those things and check back in with them in the future? And lots of really fulsome discussion across a broad range of topics. But I'll just kind of summarize that work and encourage you that the final report gets into a bit more detail. What we walked away with and where the MOSPRA program is going to be turning now. We found that there was great, really, the workshop was very experimental, pretty new to people, and we had really good feedback. But one of the points we got was we sort of had 3 focal areas and people from all over the Commonwealth. And there was an appetite to do some more hyper local workshops where we focus really on going into a community and working more directly with their local resilience, their MVP programs and others, and tying together the MOSPRA program to other activities related to climate. There are some internal updates within the program looking at the GRSs that we have, the coastal booming strategies, some of the vulnerability of trailers and other response assets that may be in vulnerable areas. We talked a lot about opportunities to promote decarbonization. So it's kind of revolutionary for a program that's funded by oil that comes into the state to think about ways to use that funding to have less oil. But it's also really exciting. And then really a lot of this work was around connecting the MOSPRA program and the experts within the oil spill prevention and response world, which is a very small community, with other experts in the state on all of the elements that come into the risk. So I hope I didn't go too far over my time. And thank you very much for the opportunity. There were a lot of people that contributed to this work. I'm happy to present it, but I really it was just one of many.
Elise, as always, a pleasure having you. I hope you stick around to the end of the meeting in case that there are some questions or comments. I really want to hear from the advisory committee members and the public and the LSPs that are participating today. I honestly, I think this work has been very profound and extremely thought-provoking for our ER response program, particularly if we are dealing with new fuels that may not, for example, have reportable concentrations in our mammals. So those are the kinds of things that at a very granular level, making those connections with where the future is taking us, we need to stay on top of those things so we can actually ensure that our regulations also reflect the current challenges and all we're seeing. So I'd like to at this moment pause and check in to see if anyone has questions or comments, and stay on the lookout for this particular document that's going to be uploaded very soon, and I'm sure that we'll have some press around it, or at least signal to the LSP practitioning community in other partners that it's ready for your review and enjoyment. So any questions for Elise? I see a comment. Amazing work. Terrific, Elise. This is from Michelle O'Brien.
Yeah,
Millie,
oh,
Michelle Paul had a
Yes.
question. Just wanted to bring it. I didn't know if you saw that.
Yeah, no, it's not so much a question as just a comment. This is great work, and it's so important. Everybody's just going through their everyday lives out there on the harbor, in whether it's fishing or offshore wind or recreation. So it's important work that we really focus on this, and I make myself available to Southeast region and to Elise for any way that we can further this really important work, and thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Fantastic, Michelle. Thank you so much for participating, and New Bedford being a host community for us getting in there and capturing all those experiences and facilitating meaningful conversation that really shaped the content and conclusions and living document, right, Elise?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Any last thoughts, Elise? Since we have a couple more moments here to spend with you.
No, I think to Michelle's point, I think there's more to explore in New Bedford and in a lot of other coastal communities. And I think maybe Kathy wants to add to this that sort of our next phase of this work will be trying to gauge interest and maybe do some more in-depth scenario work with, that just focuses on experts. We had a really great, I think he was a commissioner from New Bedford, local participant, but that local knowledge really just layers in so much more depth than you can get as kind of a generalist coming in.
Yeah, I was just going to add that's one of the things that we're evaluating now is looking at the recommendations and which ones are within our purview, and certainly there were some recommendations that are outside of MOSPRA and DEP, and how do we incorporate these recommendations going forward for the program as a whole, and even reaching out to other programs and other agencies and organizations as well. So it's part of our next steps.
I guess thank you, Kathy. And I guess a last sort of practical best practice tip here. As you know, our MCP was just amended. It includes, it touches on climate change, readiness, mitigation. So some of this work might maybe serve as an inspiration to licensed site professionals when thinking about their site assessment, when thinking about selection of remedies. So I just want to say that, again, MassDEP is so grateful to Elise, Nuka, all the partners that Elise identified in that last slide. And I hope that this content, was something that the advisory committee appreciates. I really do. And I just want to say again, thank you so much to all those that made this happen. And I hope it serves as an inspiration for LSPs when they're going through an analysis of how to ensure that every single point that's been sampled and analyzed, can at least hopefully some strategies to memorialize that knowledge and then build upon that knowledge in selecting remedies. So I see a hand from Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Millie. And everyone, thank you very much. I'm really very pleased. I was involved with this and I had some of my administrative people involved. I belong on that last things we were talking about, outreach. I belong to an attorney networking group for the last 6 years. And mostly attorneys that I work with, it's provisors and Braintree, but they have about 15 outlets within the whole greater Boston area. And I'm on 2 real estate subcommittees with them. And it's a terrific outreach because we got bankers and some developers and people like that. And I think, my involvement, and I think we have a lot we can add to the program and getting involved. Unless I have actually one attorney that I'm working with, and I'm teaching him about our process in the LSP, because a lot of them have been really in the dark about having direct involvement with DEP until they get an NOI or responsibility or something like that, and then as good as we LSPs are, we're not attorneys, we're not business people, we're not a lot of things. So I'll bring that to your attention when I see in the future. And I think it'd be a fabulous resource. But thank you.
Of course, Joe. Thank you very much. Just stay in touch with us. Email me, call me. Happy to assist.